All right, so I think I left off on the second slide of the Commonwealth and Empire lecture, the one with Teddy Roosevelt on the first slide. So I emailed you a copy of my teacher notes of lectures, so you can fill in the blanks of anything that's missing in your student lecture. And then I don't have a whiteboard with me, so I won't be writing anything down. This is the first time I've tried this, so we'll see how it goes. But feel free, of course, to add anything down that I say, compare, contrast, cause and effects, little anecdotes like that. Get them down in your notes, and we'll see how this goes. So good luck on Tuesday and Wednesday, and we'll see how this goes. So I know I believe in first period, we got to a compare contrast between the Grange and the Populist, the Farmers Alliance, on the other hand. So this is very similar to that compare contrast we did on the Knights of Labor and the AFL. So remember, the AFL will be around from the late 19th century up to the present. It's the largest union in the world today. It's since merged with the CIO. It's the AFL-CIO now, but back then it's the AFL. We have the Knights of Labor. This is very similar. So in the late 19th century, remember, slightly more than half people still live on farms, about 60% or so. And so you have these things that exist then that don't exist anymore, farming collectives. Think of them as like labor unions, but for farmers. So farmers that are experiencing troubles, trials, tribulations, they bind together and they try to cooperate, share, get things done so that their lives can be better as a collective. So the Grange, they differ because, like the Knights of Labor, they're mostly immigrant-based. The Grange are mostly German and Scandinavian. Remember Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland. Immigrants coming from those countries, late 19th century, they're settling in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, the Nebraskas. Very hardworking people, they're thriving in America, but things are very, very difficult. Immense startup costs from fertilizers, irrigation equipment, tractors, all kinds of things like that. They felt that they were getting ripped off by three large American corporations: the banks, the railroad companies, and the silo operators. So the banks would charge native-born American corporations discount rates because they're very wealthy, economies of scale. You guys get really good interest rates for depositing your money. If you want to borrow money, you could do that at a cheap interest rate. But since you guys are, Swedish farmers, we don't trust you, we don't like you, we could take advantage of you, we're going to charge you higher interest rates when you borrow, and when you deposit, we're going to charge you lower interest rates. Second was the railroad companies. Railroad companies, when you are paying to move huge amounts of freights along the railroads, we're going to give you a huge discount. You're native-born Americans. But if you are Swedish, German, Norwegian, we're going to charge you guys a lot more. At least it felt that way to the Grangers. Third, the biggest crooks of all, the silo operators. Farming is a very difficult business. It's not like agriculture. It's not like manufacturing, where if you say are overproducing, the market's overproducing, prices are very low for your commodity, you're losing money for every quantity that you sell. You just lay people off, you cut back on production, problem solves itself rather easily. Farming is weird that way, that it takes a long time to produce, and you are planting and producing in the spring for when the harvest is done in the fall. So it's very unpredictable, and farmers always have this problem, or often have this problem, where they overproduce. They produce way, way too much grain, and then they're at market and they're actually losing for every bushel of grain that they produce. So what are you to do? You can sell at a loss, which nobody wants to do. Sometimes you can turn that into whiskey, then you pay the excise tax. Third way out is that you could store it. You go to a silo, you store it for a season or two, you hope that prices come up the next season, which they probably would if they're particularly low, and you study the market, so you probably know that. Problem was, these silo operators were just crooked. There was no regulations on them, and they would take advantage. If you didn't know the language well, if you didn't know the law well, you, the immigrant, would come in and store your grain there. You come in the next season to collect it, they give you a claim ticket, and they would give you far less grain, far less quality grain, mix yours up with somebody else on purpose. There was nothing that you could do. So to to get recourse there, the Grangers, as they were called, they would form a farming collective. They would get their friends, get their compatriots elected to office, and they changed the laws in a lot of these upper Midwestern states, particularly Illinois. Illinois in the 1870s taken over by the Grangers, even more than the Democrats or Republicans, and they passed very strict regulations on the banks, on the silos, on the railroad companies. In the short term, it seemed to solve their problem in 1873, 74, 75. By the 1880s, though, the U.S. Supreme Court, extremely conservative, started to strike down these state laws, arguing, for instance, well, you're Illinois, you're passing railroad regulation laws. The railroad passes all the way through your state. It's an interstate railroad, and so therefore, we're going to strike down that regulation. Sorry, Grangers, you can't do that. So this was sort of a short-lived success story, the Grangers, at least for these immigrant farmers, but they did manage to pass a few laws in the short term, about 5 years or so in the early 1870s. The second is the Farmers Alliance. Think of them as like the AFL. The Farmers Alliance, sometimes called the Populace, similar problems. They saw it a little bit differently, though. Number one, they didn't see the banks, the silos, the railroad companies as their enemy. They saw immigrants as their enemy. They saw the Grangers as their enemy. So they argued for restricting immigration, petitioned the federal government to lower quotas. They never were really able to get that done. Second, all right, if we are going to let these immigrants in, how about we pass a law that says you can't own land until you're a naturalized citizen. You can't be a legal resident and just own land. The argument, the more people that flood into the country and are producing, the lower the prices will be, the harder it is for me. They never were able to really get that done, the Populace. What they excelled at, because on the one hand, we don't like their xenophobic aspect, but we do like these other things they did, which were extraordinary. They had the first idea for the secret or the Australian ballot, because there was a lot of corruption at this time. Wealthy people in both parties could sort of bribe people, intimidate people to cast a ballot. Ballots were cast in public. Now the idea was, let's do what the Australians are doing. They just started to do this in the late 19th century. You go into a booth, you close the little curtain there, you cast your ballot. It's all done in secret. There's no retribution. You can cast your ballot free of conscience. It's a great idea, and it's the essence of democracy today. No one would want to get rid of it. We owe that to the Populace. That was a great idea. Other ideas they had. They wanted to lower tariffs so that they could buy farming equipment for cheaper. Sometimes they get these laws passed. By and large, they wouldn't, though. The Republican Party usually dominated the Congress and kept tariffs pretty high during this time period. They wanted nationalization of the railroads, which is an extraordinary thing. You know, today we would call this socialism, communism. They were never able to get that done, but they started agitating for those kind of things. They wanted a graduated income tax. Graduated income tax, first of all, there is no income tax at this time in the late 19th century. We had it a brief time period during the Civil War, a little bit during Reconstruction, then it was phased out, and most people celebrated that. Americans did not like an income tax at the time. Few other countries were starting to do this. They felt this was more fair, and it makes sense, because if you are a farmer and you're paying an excise tax on whiskey, you're paying high prices for imported goods, a tariff, then taxes disproportionately impact you. The federal government is very streamlined at this time. There's not much taxes anywhere, and it made sense that because America was so unequal, why not make a tax where the burden falls most heavily on the rich? The poor won't have to pay it at all. And an income tax, you could tailor-make it so that you do that. So here's how it works. The worst kind of way to do an income tax is a regressive tax. Everybody pays $1,000. $1,000 to Bill Gates, nothing. $1,000 to a very poor person, a huge proportion of their income. That's a regressive tax. That's the worst way to do it. Some people would say the most fair way to do it would be to just have a flat rate. Everybody pays 15%. Doesn't matter. If you're Bill Gates, 15%. If you're poor, 15%. And that way it feels the same to everybody. We don't do that. We do the most progressive way to do it in America, and we're pretty conservative compared to most other countries, is to do a progressive or graduated income tax. The rate increases as your income increases. Many Americans don't pay any income tax at all because we don't have an income tax on the poorest Americans. You start paying an income tax once you make about $30,000, $40,000 a year. It's pretty minimal. When you get into the middle class, into the $40,000 and $50,000 range, you pay about 10%, 15% or so. And at the highest echelon today, you pay, I believe, about 35%. Most people don't even pay that because they have deductions and such. So the rate increases as you make more money. That was thought of by the populace. It was actually pioneered by the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the Anarchist Party. That's why it was not very popular in America at the time. And the populace were starting to call for it and get very animated about these things. And when we finally get it in 1913, the populace are largely the party that can claim credit for that. So those are your two parties. You have the immigrant-based one, you have the populist-based one, the native-born-based one. The problem was they fought each other more than fighting against, who their true enemies were, and that kind of prevented them from actually achieving progress and, getting what they actually needed done. Next thing I see on this slide is letter C, which is the Great Uprising of 1877. So this is an extraordinary story. It's incredible. I never learned about it when I was in high school, and when I went to college, I remember hearing about it and just being stunned, because Americans, you don't really hear about us taking to the streets, trying to take over certain things, trying to change things immediately. It sounds like the French or something. So here's the story. Panic of 1873. Ulysses Grant is president, overinvestment in railroads, railroad companies bust, banks bust, unemployment skyrockets to 20-25%. It was the worst recession in our history, and it dragged on for 5 years. It was dreadful. Now, what shielded most Americans at this time from the true pain of this is that most Americans were still farmers. The price of grain goes down, it's harder to make ends meet, but you're not going to starve most likely. However, there's a growing proportion of Americans who live in cities. They make wages, and so this was very, very difficult for them. Now, what happens is, for 2 consecutive years in a row, railroad workers get their wages cut. They get a 10% wage cut, and then they get another 10% wage cut in 1877, and they're just fit to be tied. Now, 10% may not sound like a lot, but if I took a 10% wage cut, there's a lot of things I built into my budget that I may not be able to afford. When you make an income, then you buy a home and you buy cars, and you get these monthly payments based on that income. And when that income is threatened, when it's your kids, when you might lose your home, you get very desperate. This is a time when men could not rely on their wives' incomes to help them out. Women helped out around the house, but married women did not earn an income at this time, pretty much by and large. So it's desperation time. The story begins in Martinsburg, West Virginia, just unassuming place. It's a very small town. It's a connection point from east to west. It's where basically most of the railroads are going to go from Baltimore, Pennsylvania, over the Appalachians into Ohio. And workers there, without any direction from their labor union or anything, they just decide, we're going to go on strike. We're not going to make the railroads move until we get a wage increase. So they just decouple the engine. That's, the little clamp that's on the front end of the locomotive, and it connects to the rest of the train cars. They just decouple it. This is a highly skilled profession, and so if they aren't going to make the trains run, nobody's going to make the trains run. They decouple it. Then they go on a bit of a rampage. Some of them get on some of the locomotives. They get them up to a full head of steam. They jump off the side of the train, and they get the trains to jump the tracks and take out some of the stations. They start blowing up, dynamiting, burning some of the locomotives. There's just jubilation. Nobody had planned this, and when it spread throughout the whole town, there's just tremendous feelings of solidarity amongst the workers. And because of technology, because of the telegraph line, because of the telephones, this is 1877, word spreads about the strike just like wildfire all over the country. Workers hear about this in Buffalo, New York, several hundred miles away, and they do the same thing. They go on strike and they refuse to let any traffic go. Workers in Philadelphia, workers in Baltimore, workers in Pittsburgh, workers in New York City, workers 3,000 miles away in San Francisco decide, we're not going to do this either. Solidarity, all the workers together. This was not planned, it was spontaneous. Just workers were feeling the same thing, railroad workers all throughout the country. And this is frightening to the business class and to the government, because the railroads were everything. It's how the U.S. mail moved through the country. It's how Carnegie got all of his steel out of his factories to buildings, to railroad companies who needed it. It's how iron and everything else moved. It's how timber moved. It was, you know, imagine if the U.S. highway system was just shut down overnight. But it was more than that, because it was the only way that you could move anything. And it was mostly the communication system, too. And so this just sent shockwaves through America. Workers are just marching in the streets, and it gets incredibly violent. Dozens of people are killed. Over 100 people die in this. The stories are extraordinary. In Philadelphia, and this is 1 year after our centennial, right? This is 1877. And workers in Philadelphia, cradle of our revolution, are barricading streets and literally getting into street battles with the Philadelphia police, with the Pennsylvania National Guard, and just shooting it out with them. Now, they do reestablish control, but it went on for 45 days like this. For a while there, President Hayes dithered. He didn't know what to do because it was nationwide. Governors at first tried to quash it. It didn't work very well, and eventually U.S. soldiers had to be called out, but not before some really great stories. I think my favorite of which is St. Louis, a very heavily immigrant city, mostly German and Irish. And German workers were German immigrants who were no friends of the French. They actually stand arm in arm with other workers, railway workers, and they start singing La Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem from the French Revolution, and they start marching down the streets, rifles in hand, shut down St. Louis so that no trains could go through there. And there's this, you know, feeling of mirth and happiness all throughout the country on this. Maybe this is the second American Revolution, perhaps, which is exciting on their part, terrifying for the government, terrifying for the business class. Out west in San Francisco, the story gets a little more depressing. The workers, rather than celebrating in kind of a jubilant way, they do it first, but then they unfortunately go on this rampage and riot through San Francisco's Chinatown, blaming the Chinese for a lot of their problems and venting a lot of their frustrations on them, burning blocks of that neighborhood, which is terrible. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem to taint the mood too much in the country. It was absolute pandemonium, coast to coast. This is the summer of 1877. Now remember, Hayes comes to the presidency in a very bizarre method. There's a backroom deal. There was this disputed election, so he kind of hesitated for a while. Eventually, he sends in the U.S. Army and just brutally crushes this this would-be revolution. Now, it was almost a victim of its own success. There was no plan. The workers shut down the railroads, and they thought, well, I guess we'll just get our wages increased soon, but corporations have deep pockets, and they had no plan after that. There was not even a union that organized all of this, and because it was spontaneous, it fizzled out after the U.S. Army came in. So this is a bit of the backlash against the Reconstruction period. Right after the Civil War, there was a feeling maybe blacks deserve civil rights, maybe we should have an income tax, maybe we should have a strong national state. News overseas, there was another French Revolution in 1871, the Paris Commune. This happened in America. There were these terrible stories of the Molly Maguires. The Molly Maguires were a secret society of Irish miners who, in Pennsylvania, they would actually assassinate their bosses, blow up the mines, do, you know, kind of insane, really violent things. And there were big trials of these terrorists, so to speak. And these things coupled together create a bit of a backlash. Going into the 1880s, America's going to lapse into a much more conservative period, and people are not going to like this. At the same time, it made people really wonder, is there a better way of handling this? Maybe there needs to be a method that workers can go to a tribunal, ask for better wages, ask for better conditions, rather than just have these incredibly violent things happen. Only in America was this really happening. Labor disputes in America far more violent in the 19th century than any other country on earth. So, I think we're good on slide 2. So why don't we go to slide 3? So slide 3, we have similar stories here. We're just going to fast forward about 20 years. So times get good again in the 1880s. People forget about the recession. People forget about the strikes. economy's growing, immigrants are coming in, we have steel mills, we have lumber mills, we have, garment factories, New York City's blowing up really big. And then the bottom falls out again in 1893. This is yet another panic, the Panic of 1893. It even is worse than the Panic of 1873, if one can imagine that. This is the worst recession in American history up to this point. Now, economists today have sort of looked back and they've reassessed and relabeled the Panic of 1893 because it just doesn't do it justice. This is, again, a 5-year recession, 25% unemployment nationally, and even fewer Americans were farming at this time, about half at this particular time. So there's not much to lean back on. Industrial workers were just devastated by this. It's often called the First Great Depression. I mean, putting it in that league kind of gives you a scale for how bad this is. The Great Depression of the 1930s, the worst economic recession in our history. This is called the First Great Depression, and only slightly not as bad as the second. It was eventually solved by J.P. Morgan just writing a check to the U.S. government and bailing the U.S. government out. But for a while there, it was just absolutely terrible. A couple of features of this. Number one, this is the first time where Americans actually organize and ask the government for help. There's a Union veteran by the name of Jacob Coxey, served in the U.S. Civil War, and he organizes 20,000 homeless people in America to march on Washington, D.C. and ask the government to do something, a pension plan, some sort of aid for homeless people, some sort of jobs program. And it just fell on deaf ears. Remember, this is the age of social Darwinism, that we can't help the poor because this will just encourage failure. People that are poor are genetically inferior, according to this theory, and we just can't help them out at all. So even though Coxey has, he lends an air of credibility to this movement, he's a respectable person, and he gives numerous speeches, it just really goes nowhere. And so you have violence. You have 3 incredibly violent strikes, all in the middle of the 1830s, all as a result of this recession. So the first is the Homestead strike. Homestead is in Pennsylvania. This is one of Andrew Carnegie's factories. It's in western Pennsylvania, right on the border of Ohio, right next to Lake Erie. And it's one of many steel mills that he owns. So even in good times, the conditions are brutal. We're talking about temperatures over 100 degrees on the factory floors, just coal dust in the air, back-breaking work. We're talking about 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, just absolutely wretched conditions, even in good times. And again, when the economy dips, not as much money coming into the business, the boss cuts wages. Next year it gets even worse, he cuts wages again. Now today, there's all kinds of protections for this. If you lose your job, you get disability. Or you get unemployment insurance. If you get injured, you get disability. None of those things existed in the 1890s. And so if you get your wages cut, there's no protection. There's no protection at all. And so people were desperate. And so the workers in Homestead decided to take matters into their own hands. They went and they got rifles and they commandeered some barges. This is right outside of Riverway, where the steel is being loaded onto barges, and the workers would get on these barges and go to the factory every day. And they decided to commandeer them with their rifles. They arrive at the front of the factory, and they essentially padlock the front of it, and they stand guard, and they say, "We will not let anyone into the factory. Carnegie, we know that you have these contracts where you have to sell your steel to these people, and if you don't deliver, you default, you're in trouble, so just pay us our better wages. You have deep, deep pockets. You could probably not make a profit for 10 years and just pay us on the money that you've made for the last 20 years, and you'd be fine, so why don't you take the hit instead of us?" I sympathize with that argument. And so Carnegie does not do this. He felt that if he gave into the union, they would make more demands and more demands and more demands until they broke him and made him penniless. So he called out the Pinkertons. Remember, the Pinkertons are these armed private security forces. He feels, this is my factory, what right do you have to padlock it? And so he puts them on barges with guns, and there's literally a gun battle, dozens of deaths. The strikers work, or they win this confrontation in the first instance, but after time, Carnegie is able to move in more Pinkertons and get the factory open, and the workers lose completely. They're fired, they're replaced by these other workers, and the other workers are paid far less. Now, Carnegie has an interesting reputation in America. He's, considered the good robber baron, the one who, upon his death, he gave 95% of his money away to charity, created the Carnegie Foundation, etc., etc. However, this is a very ugly story. There were women, wives who went with their husbands to work to protest. There were children that went along, and they are killed as well in this. It affected Carnegie. He was not inhuman. He felt sorrow for this, and he was never quite the same. After this, he went on this long, sort of soul-searching trip to Europe. He became less and less interested in his factory, and just a few years later, he's going to liquidate his business, sell it to J.P. Morgan, and just get out of the business entirely, and then upon his death, he gives all his money away. So it very much affected him, and he was never quite the same. Now, here's the thing. He gets all this credit for giving money to charities upon his death, and my response to this always is like, if you had all that money that you could give to charity, you could have given it to your workers before. It makes no sense to me why you would be so stingy and tight with your money and squeeze and, try to strangulate your workers and then just give that money to charity afterwards and pat yourself on the back for it. And especially the fact that workers were killed in this. He had his workers killed. Now, they were acting violent as well, but there was no appeal to government. Maybe we need to negotiate a truce or anything. He just felt, this is my business, and it's my way or the highway. So that's Andrew Carnegie, the nice robber baron. Then we have Coeur d'Alene. Now, Coeur d'Alene's way out west in Idaho, very near the Canadian border. It's a mining town. Same story. I won't go through all of the details, but it's the same story over again. Recession. Workers' wages were cut, they were cut again, and workers decided that they would just padlock the entryway to the mine. Pinkertons come out, there's a confrontation, and workers decided, we're just going to blow up the mine. If we can't have it, then nobody else can have it, and they destroyed the mine. Complete devastation, people killed on both sides, and there's no appeal to government in this. The government felt, we just stay out of it, there's no role here. Right? This is why we don't know Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison, because they just cowered in Washington, D.C. and let workers just handle this on their own and let employers just kill their workers. That was America in the late 19th century. Finally, Pullman. Pullman, again, another railway strike. Wages were cut twice in the same year in the mid-1890s. And again, this is mostly localized in Illinois, but it did paralyze the lines going through Illinois, so a lot of the American railroads were shut down. President Cleveland sent out the troops, brutally repressed it, dozens of people killed in this as well. After the violence, the strike then spreads to 26 other states, and then it had to be brutally repressed there as well. So it doesn't quite get to the magnitude of the Great Uprising of 1877, but it is darn near close. And there was a bit of a turning point here. This is 1894. At this point, after 3 major strikes, all within just a year-and-a-half period, with dozens of people killed on both sides, Americans start to ask the question, does it have to be this way? Why are we the only country that has this kind of strife between labor and capital? Why can't labor unions and bosses find a solution peacefully? Find a solution to their differences peacefully, rather than just this wholesale slaughter. You guys, I'm sure, have never heard of this before. When you hear about strikes in America, LA Unified is on strike right now. I guarantee you it's not going to end with the teachers getting their guns and going outside the schools and with Pinkertons coming out and shooting at them. It's not going to happen. And that's a very good thing. And some people complain, the unions have too much power. It'd be nice if we could just fire all the teachers. Yeah, well, maybe, but there's a reason why we don't do that anymore. We went through this evolutionary process in the 1890s. It's not like we just woke up one day and all these unions were here. They evolved, and we tolerate them because the difference is workers get so desperate. Desperation is not a good thing in a democracy. You want people to have a voice. That unions give the people that voice. So, we'll skip over to the next slide now. So, the next slide, number 4, politics and nativism. So this all comes to a head with the very famous election of 1896. So it's famous for a lot of reasons. Number 1, this election has the highest voter turnout ever in America. Over 90% of Americans who were registered to vote went out and voted. Now, it's not as impressive today because remember, 90% of African Americans can't vote because they live in the Jim Crow South. Women, by and large, can't vote in 1896. But of the white men who were registered to vote, they went out and voted this cycle because it seemed like everything was on the table. The economy's terrible, and there were two very interesting characters running this year. So, first, the issues. It's very bad economy. Times are very desperate. Nobody seems to be endorsing Jacob Coxey and his radical ideas or the populace of an income tax or anything like that. In fact, the one idea that seems to be getting a little bit of traction is silver policy. So at this time we had the gold standard, American dollars made essentially, they could be traded in for gold at banks. Silver was minted on occasion when it was felt it was necessary to inflate the currency. It was done very infrequently. So, for instance, the Sherman Silver Act was passed in the 1880s. That was repealed by the Democrats in the early 1890s, and it wiped them out at the polls. In 1894, the workers go out and say, how dare the Democrats repeal that? We're going to vote them out, and they did. The House of Representatives changed in 1894. So what does silver have to do with the good economy? Why would this help out? Well, it doesn't help everybody. You have to have debt for this to matter. So workers who were poor and, you work in a factory, you typically didn't have debt, but you didn't have any money either. Farmers, on the other hand, which this is 1890s, about half of Americans are still farmers. Farmers had a lot of debt, and this would help you inflate away your debt. It's very technical. You don't have to understand all the ins and outs of it, but just understand silver inflates away your debt. Put it this way. Let's say that you guys graduate from college and you have $250,000 of debt from mostly student loans, maybe some credit cards and stuff, but let's say you got $250,000 of debt. Now that sounds horrendous. Let's say your starting salary you get out of college is $60,000. You get a good job making $60,000. So you make in a year roughly about 1/4 of what your total debt is. It's not a good ratio to have because that's not a home or anything like that. You're going to have to rent. You're probably going to have to work 10, 15 years or so, maybe more to pay that off. Now, what if perchance there was rampant inflation the first 10 years you got out of college? Your salary goes from 60 to 80 to 120 to $200,000. Now, your dollars would buy less in the market, and we're not sure what the consumer price index is. You don't need to know all that. So assume prices go up, and overall you're probably doing a little bit better. But what's happened to your debt? Your debt does not grow. So if you make $250,000 and your debt is $250,000, your debt is now easier to pay off for you. It makes sense. Business owners get this. Farmers, who basically are business owners, get this. And this was their one, pardon the pun, silver bullet that they thought would solve this depressionary problem. And so this is a huge issue in 1896. The Democrats have learned their lesson, and they've jumped whole hog into this, and they've nominated a very dynamic figure, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, wonderful speaker, firebrand speaker. He was the youngest person ever to run for president. He was only 36 years old when he ran for president. Now, that may not seem very young to you guys, but remember the Constitution mandates you have to be at least 35 to run for president, so he's just barely over that limit. He's from Nebraska. He's from a big farming state. He's a hardcore fundamentalist Protestant, and he's sort of a lay preacher. He knew the Bible very well, and he's the kind of guy who he goes to these outdoor tent revivals in the summer where there's a preacher out there, and they would recognize William Jennings Bryan, and they'd invite him up, and he would just preach extemporaneously off the top of his head for 2-3 hours, and he did not need a microphone or anything. He could speak to a crowd of 5,000 people, and everybody could hear him. He had this wonderful voice. So he is nominated, and his nomination really illustrates the divisions in the Democratic Party at the time. The Democratic Party is really two halves. It's waspy farmers in the West, mostly, in the Great Plains states and in the far West. Those people were pretty solidly Democratic. Also farmers in the South, I'm sort of lumping those in together. The other half was immigrants in the big cities. Workers in factories. They were Democrat because the Democratic Party always wanted to keep the floodgates of immigration open and leave immigrants alone. But they're very divided, meaning what was William Jennings Bryan going to do for Italian and Jewish immigrants in New York City? Nothing. He didn't mention them. He didn't think they were that great. In fact, he gives a very famous speech at the convention where he doesn't talk to them or about them at all. Bryan mostly at the convention talks about farmers. He talks about farmers and he talks about farmers, and he uses a lot of this sort of Jeffersonian Republican agrarianism kind of rhetoric, that farmers are the greatest people of all time, that if you were to get rid of the cities, farmers would be just fine. They would survive and they would thrive and they would do great. But if farmers disappeared, the cities would grow over with grass and they would starve. Okay, which is not true. At least the first half of that is not true. After all, he says, if cities disappeared, farms would be okay. Well, who would be buying all the farmers' produce? Farmers were so productive, they needed markets for, their goods. So there's a symbiosis going on there, and he just ignores all of this. He really should have reached out to immigrants. He might have won the election. Spoiler alert. But he didn't reach out to them. The Republicans nominate colorless, bland, boring William McKinley. He's the last of his kind. He's a Union veteran. We're now 30 years removed from the Civil War, and he is running on his war record. He's nearly 30 years older than William Jennings Bryan, and he's very much living in the past. Hey, vote for me and my war record. I'm a Republican. Remember the Battle of Gettysburg. We fought against slavery and secession, and we won. In fact, he's the last president to, quote, wave the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt means that Republicans would always remind voters, hey, during the Civil War, we were loyal, we fought the South, they seceded, they fought for slavery, you can't trust them. This is 30 years removed from that. It didn't seem relevant to people, and that's really all he's got. Other than that, he's going to point the finger at Bryan and say, Bryan is a lunatic, he's a radical, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Bryan also, at his speech, I neglected to mention this, William Jennings Bryan gave this fiery speech where he said that farmers are like Jesus Christ, and you cannot crucify farmers on a cross of gold. You cannot push down with the crown of silver upon their brow. Okay, which everybody got the meaning of this, that he is fusing together fundamentalist Protestantism with Republican agrarianism, right? That farmers are the greatest people in the world, and they're sacrificing right now, they're suffering right now like Jesus Christ, and we need to end that, and silver will do that. Gold is crucifying people, silver will liberate them. So, McKinley tells them you can't listen to this, that silver will destroy the economy. Now, why is McKinley so against silver? The flip side of silver is that it's horrible for creditors. If you loan money to people, inflation's your worst enemy. Now, on that thought experiment I gave you a couple minutes ago, imagine you're on the opposite of that. Let's say you loan one of your friends today. Let's say you loan somebody $100 today, one of your friends. The prom, winter formal, whatever they need it for, you loan them $100. Let's say they pay you back at the 40-year reunion in 2059, and they say, here you go, thanks a lot, here's that $100. Is that $100 the same value in 2049 or 2059 that it is today? Certainly not. $100 probably won't get you a movie theater ticket in 40 years. This is why when people loan out money, they charge interest. Interest is supposed to outstrip the pace of inflation so that it takes care of it, so that you're getting paid back the principal, what you loan them, plus something a little extra that will take care of the inflation rate. So bankers hated the idea of silver, and McKinley is very friendly to the bankers. It's also a very modern election in that this is the first one where there's huge campaign donations. McKinley is the favorite of the rich, so all of those robber barons I told you out, they get out their checkbooks and they're writing huge donations to William McKinley. J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, they're all giving immense money to William McKinley because they want him to win, because they will be less rich if silver goes through and if farmers get their way. So, McKinley outraises Bryan 10-1. It's a very, very close race, actually. If you look on at your map on slide 4, the red is the Republican states, the blue is the Democratic states. There's a lot of blue there, Bryan wins the solid South and the West. Here's the problem. Bryan should have won this election. If he had just reached out to immigrants, there were so many immigrants in America at this time, he probably could have won New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, maybe Pennsylvania. He didn't need all those states, just 2 or 3 of them, and he would have won the election, but he did not say a word to Irish, Italian, Jewish immigrants at this time, and so they didn't come out for him in very large numbers, even though overall voter turnout's very high. The immigrant vote was a little bit suppressed, and McKinley wins, and he's the last of these sort of colorless, bland, kind of boring people, and we really have no legacy for him, other than the Spanish-American War, which we'll get into later. We don't really hear very much from McKinley about any policy. He gets in there, he raises the tariff, doesn't do silver policy, and just waits out the Depression, and things finally get better by about 1898, 99. Things finally start to get a little bit better, and the Depression sort of fixes itself. Now, what you'll note at this time is the parties actually agreed on a lot of stuff. There's going to be some weird realignment of the parties, you know, over the time period of our history. So one thing, we talked about how it used to be the Democrats were the very pro-expansionist party. Manifest Destiny. We want Texas. We want Mexico. That's when the Democrats were pro-slavery. There's no slavery anymore in the 1890s. The Democratic Party is actually a very anti-expansionist policy at this time. It's the Republicans, McKinley, and especially Theodore Roosevelt, who imagine America as an empire. They admire the British Empire and they want to see us expand, and so that's going to be part of the logic of going into Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in the 1890s. Is it's the Republican Party platform. We want more and more territory. Not for slavery, but, you know, for resources, for markets, and for the glory of America. Second is both parties are incredibly racist at this time. White supremacy was taught at every university. It's part of the social Darwinist theory. It's awful, it's terrible, but it was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, a liberal labor union that was actually in favor of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Just excluding an entire race of people from the United States, feeling that too many Chinese workers were coming in, depressing white workers' wages, and so it was right in the text of the bill. Let's not let Chinese workers in anymore. They're driving down our wages. Mr. Gompers, the head of the AFL, also believed in this Catholic conspiracy that the Catholic Church wanted to destroy America and flood America with refugees, with poor people, so that it would depress wages in America and it would cease for us to exist as a democracy. Still, there's this fight of Protestants feel we are the true, unique, original Americans. Catholics and other immigrants, they're weakening our values and they're ruining us. They like to drink, they like to dance, they like to have fun, they don't adhere to our Victorian morality, and we don't like them. And, of course, the embracing of Jim Crow. Even the Republican Party did not really feel that they should go out on a limb and try to get black people to vote in the South. Now, if you ask them, they thought it'd probably be a good thing because the Republican Party would win more elections. They tried it in Reconstruction. We talked about that. It failed. And there is zero. It's just condemned by silence. Both parties don't say a word about this. And this next slide I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on. I'm going to cut right here because I've gone almost 45 minutes and I want to make sure I have enough room on my phone to save this. But in the next video, I'll talk quite at length about Jim Crow, about this system, this horrible system in America. And you can hear about how both parties thought this was fine, and this was the system in America from the 1890s up until the 1960s, some 70 years. Okay.